Black economic empowerment, a policy supposedly designed to achieve redress and inclusion. But what is the actual impact? We at the Free Market Foundation, together with Solidarity Research Institute, have published this report on the costs of BEE compliance. I'm delighted to be joined by the co-authors of the report, Theuns du Buisson, who is an economic researcher at Solidarity Research Institute, as well as Dr Morné Malan, who is a senior associate with the Free Market Foundation. Theuns and Morné, welcome to Northwood's House. I'd like to start off by providing our audience with a background to this report. Theuns, you approached us at the FMF with the proposal to do a deep dive diagnostic on the impacts of BEE. What motivated you to do so?
Yeah, David, thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, the need arose because everyone knows that there are costs incurred in order to comply with BEE, but no one was able to give us a figure. And often when you ask what does it cost, people are unwilling to even touch this subject because, Black economic empowerment, it sounds noble. We've all been taught that this is the only way to transform the South African economy to include more people. But we can clearly see that that has not been happening. And if there's a cost incurred, then surely it must have a severe negative impact on the overall economy. And without economic growth, you can't really empower anyone, especially in economic terms. So our report was then created and set up to calculate what that cost is to the economy. And I think we've done a great job at showing that the cost is immense and it's not empowering people. Quite the contrary, it's keeping people poor and keeping people out of opportunities for empowerment.
Yeah, and Thomas Sowell once said that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And I think in South Africa, there's often a lot of magical thinking to assume that we can have all of these grand policy designs and that there will be no costs associated with it. But I think that that's a very dangerous way of approaching public policy.
No, for sure. And if you look at the trade-off here, it's supposed to be people are being, wealth is being redistributed. But if you're just redistributing the same wealth over and over again without creating any new wealth, surely at some point you're going to run out of wealth. And then what's the trade-off to speak of? You're trading a successful or fairly successful economy for one that's completely dysfunctional, with basically empowering a handful of people over and over again at the cost of everyone else. And that will also run out eventually. So we show that there is a clear cost to BEE without any real benefits. So if you want to get into what the trade-off is, there aren't any. It's just sheer cost over and over again, with no tangible benefits for South Africa as a whole.
Right, well, I think we can discuss some of the methodology that informed this analysis, but let's do the bottom line up front. Morné, what were some of the findings of the report? And we'll work backwards from there and explain a bit more of our methodology.
Yeah, thank you, David. Let's look at those overall figures. Firstly, it's roughly 3% of GDP per annum is what the cost of compliance is with BEE, and I should just mention there, that's in terms of the direct costs of compliance. So it doesn't take into account necessarily those indirect costs or those costs that are incurred through the potential loss of productivity. So it's not potential investment that went astray or that we lost, which we otherwise would have had. But we're looking at roughly 3% of GDP per annum that we've lost since roughly 2007. Now that translates to, if you wipe that off in terms of the amount of jobs that you would have seen for that extra 3 percentage points of GDP, that means that we have since 2007 lost roughly just under 4 million jobs, which would have been created had we not had to incur those costs. And then finally, in terms of the overall figure, that translates to roughly 5 trillion rand in GDP that we have had to pay, that South Africans have to pay as the broader economy in order to fund the BEE scheme. And I think that that's an important thing to emphasize, is that you said that the goal of the policy was, on the one hand, to achieve redress, and on the other hand, to determine the costs associated with redress. And I think what the report shows is that not only are the costs enormous, but there's also very little redress happening. And it's actually quite ridiculous that it's a point that we have to emphasize that prosperity is shared prosperity. You can't attempt to manage an economy to such an extent that you can lift one up by, despite overall stagnation in the economy. If the economy as a whole doesn't grow, that means it's very tough for anybody or any particular group within the economy to really grow or to create prosperity. And that's really borne through in the report itself.
I think it's very necessary to understand that free market economics, or relatively free markets, it's not a zero-sum game. People trading with each other, engaging in commerce, this is a positive sum. And that rising tide really does lift all boats. When you go to the store and you buy your groceries, you say thank you to the cashier, and the cashier says thank you to you. There's the double thank yous. I think there's a philosophy that underlies this, that you need to redistribute your way to wealth, and that without some kind of state intervention, you would not have Black South Africans meaningfully participating in economic affairs. And I think that is a mistaken belief. So Theuns, before we delve into the methodological underpinnings of the report, for which we've received much criticism without much detail, maybe we could just go back in time to the origins of BEE and unpack the various stages, levels of it, and how it's unfolded over time.
Yeah, David, so initially BEE mainly dealt with ownership, which later became one of the 5 points of the scorecard. So there were massive transfers of ownership to certain Black individuals or Black groups, consortiums, etc. And so that was up until roughly 2007. Then the scorecard was introduced. And if you were trading with the state, you would have to then comply and receive your points, your BEE compliance points. And then, especially through the supplier development component on the scorecard, it basically transformed everything in South Africa. So now it's no longer just if you do business with the state or with government. It's now if you do business with companies that also in their turn provide services or products to the state. So it reaches everyone and everywhere. And that also then latches onto this critique that we've received, that if you look at people or at companies that aren't compliant, how can you infer a cost even or assume a cost on their behalf? And it's easy. Some sectors through the supplier development component specifically have been, the entire industry or the entire sector has become compliant, and if you're doing business with them, then you're also contributing to that and carrying and absorbing those inflated costs. So it's entrenched in the entire South African economy. Then with the introduction of the scorecard, it's also then later on become a requirement for licenses and permits, which we're currently seeing. If you apply for almost any license or permit, they ask for your company's BEE scorecard. So it's become so pervasive and intrusive across all sectors of the economy that even if your company does not comply, you're still carrying some of the costs directly or indirectly, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah, the business group Sakulika has described this as 3 waves of BEE. And the first 2 was the vertical application of BEE, the state and companies. But now there's also this horizontal component where you're essentially forcing suppliers throughout the value chain to comply with BEE. And those costs are distributed throughout the chain.
Yeah, and I mean, it's soft coercion to an extent, where you're doing business with another company, and now suddenly they start insisting on your BEE compliance certification, which, I mean, it shouldn't be the case. I can understand if government wants to enforce it, but the system is now set up in such a way that companies are insisting on it from each other. And yeah, I mean, it carries immense cost. Perhaps Morné can get into the cost components of the different scorecard partitions.
Yeah, I think if I could just add onto what Theuns said there, it has developed into this system which is being horizontally enforced, both not only between private actors and the government, but also between private actors and other private actors. That's not a offshoot of the policy. It's deliberately designed to do that. That's why the policies were written in the way in which they were. And I think one thing that you also have to say about those initial BEE transfers, those initial BEE schemes, is that they were largely voluntary. They were largely taken up by, the initiative was taken by those private companies themselves. There was no legislation forcing them to do that. And I think that also bears out on the economic outcomes that you see. The other important thing that Theuns mentioned there is that specific date, and that's 2007. So it's from 2007 where you really see the coercive implementation of BEE, which we know today. It's where government really takes an active role in forcing companies to comply, whether that is, as it was initially, in order to do business with government, or in order to do business with another company that does business with government, or as it is now more recently, in order to do business at all. And that's why you can see, and why a historical overview is so important, is not only because it allows us to chart the economic development of South Africa versus similar countries. So we can see that, countries that had a similar level of economic development, GDP per capita, adjusting for inflation, all those various variables. To what extent do we diverge from those countries, either in that initial period, 94 to 2007, and then post that? But we can also chart the changes in economic development in South Africa itself. So we're not only comparing ourselves to other countries, we're also comparing ourselves to ourselves prior to BEE. And that's why there's just understanding that historical picture is particularly important. Now, with regard to the way in which it's being developed, being implemented at present, the scorecard itself, and this was really what allowed us to do a lot of the analysis, despite very limited data, is divided up into 5 components. And there is this thing on the part of government where they seem to think that the more complex the system is, the better it is. But of course, that also means it's more complex to comply with. And those 5 main categories are ownership, supplier development, which Theuns already mentioned, socioeconomic development, skills development, and then the last one, which is management control. Now, the way in which, and I'm not sure if you're quite ready to go ahead onto methodology yet, but yeah, let's dive right in. The way in which we approached the task was, on the one hand, we had this issue with a real lack of data, but we knew that at some point somebody's going to have to develop something which really tries to actually wrestle with the figures, actually tries to produce some sort of coherent form of analysis. And what we did was we looked at those compliance figures, which are fairly well measured by the Commission for Black Economic Empowerment. Unfortunately, they don't publish reports as often as they should, but we looked at the most recent report, compared it to a few reports prior to, and then looked at other financial, economic, and other industry-specific reports which do have figures, which give us a guideline in terms of how much spending is taking place. So first of all, we look at those compliance percentages from the BEE Commission. They tell us that in terms of the companies that they assessed, we have let's say a 60% compliance rate on ownership, a 50% compliance rate on management control, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And then we look at those categories which have a very tangible figure. Something like supply development, that's based on net profit after tax, or something like skills development, that's measured in terms of the payroll, your total payroll that the company is paying. All those figures are figures that are available. What we did then is we looked at what would maximum compliance cost. So we know what net profit after tax is for JSE listed companies, for non-listed companies and so forth. What would maximum compliance look like for the particular category? Same thing with payroll. And we did similar extrapolations when it came to ownership, management control, and so forth. And the statistics that we produced, and so when we are talking about methodology, we're actually not just talking about a singular methodology. We're talking about various methodologies that constantly check one another. So we have the broader, more analytical approach in terms of the GDP data itself, but we also have that more comparative approach. And we were constantly checking to make sure that the one matches up with the other one. And that's also what we see in the data itself. The difference in terms of GDP growth, the divergence from other countries, the divergence from our own economy prior to BEE, that aligns with what we estimated in terms of the costs in and of themselves, which, as I said earlier, is roughly 3% of GDP per annum, roughly 4 million jobs since 2007 up until today. And I mean, the conclusion is fairly clear. It's no secret in any case that the South African economy has been performing extremely poorly for almost 2 decades now. So I think another point that just needs to be emphasized in this regard is that there's no real debate regarding the poor performance of the economy. We're just determining the actual causes of the poor performance. Anybody who wants to argue that, no, our economy's been doing gangbusters, I don't think they can be taken very seriously.
So something that I found striking and quite surprising was that when we set out to conduct this research, it seemed that nobody has really even attempted to calculate the costs. I mean, there are various reports, and I mean, your report is also filled with citations of other literature that you've consulted. The World Bank released some research recently. There's the BEE Commission work. But there seems to be a paucity of analysis out there and basic information. And my suspicion is that BEE is something of a holy cow in South Africa, that you're just supposed to accept on its face that it is beneficial and not ask too many questions.
Yeah, unfortunately, your assumption seems to be quite right. Nobody wants to touch this topic because some companies also have an entrenched benefit that they receive from this in terms of it keeps other competitors out of the market because they've already spent the money in order to comply. And it's just a hurdle that's too high for new entrants into the market. So that's the one thing. Also, banks make an immense amount of money from these BEE transfers of ownership, where companies basically go issue a bunch of shares and then take out a loan against those shares. And the beneficiaries of these special share schemes then receive it, but most of their dividends then go towards paying interest. So the big winner there is not the beneficiary of the share scheme, it's the banks. That's the big winner, and also to an extent the company itself, because they can then disguise a debt transaction as an equity transaction. So yeah, there are many entrenched interests also in terms of policy makers. The first chairman of the BEE board was Cyril Ramaphosa. Himself and his family has made vast fortunes out of black economic empowerment. So if we expect policymakers to step away from this policy, that's very unlikely to happen. So yeah, as far as we know, nobody was willing to come up with a figure, partly because of entrenched interest. I mean, if you're a consulting economist and you earn your money by doing reports on how great diversity is, and now you write a report on the negative impacts on BEE, it might cause some of your business in future to dry up. Also, in terms of compiling all the data, very limited data, it's not an easy task, and it's unlikely that someone would pay for a project such as this. It pays well if you comply, but it doesn't really pay to prove that compliance is a waste of money. So there's no real incentive to prove this. Unfortunately, if you love South Africa and you want to see the country going forward, someone has to take this stance, and we're happy to have been the ones to take up this project and prove the detrimental effects of this. Yeah, to give you another example of the absolutely devastating effect that this lack of economic growth has had, South Africa is one of very few places in the world where it's normal for someone to start in a minimum wage job and remain in that job until retirement. Because if the economy is not growing, companies aren't growing, and there's very limited range for people to be promoted within company structures. Also, if new jobs aren't being created, then you don't really usually have the option to go work somewhere else. So it's absolutely devastating. They say they're empowering black people, that's the name of the policy. Quite the opposite is happening. We've mentioned the loss of 4 million jobs since 2007. At this stage, there's currently about 600,000 people from minority groups looking for jobs. So if you exclude them, that's about 3.4 million black people who are not being empowered, who are being kept out of the labor force through these issues. Another critique that we've faced is people saying, okay, no, look, we've been underperforming our peers by roughly 3%, some years 5%. But the reason for this is not BEE, it's electricity infrastructure, transport infrastructure. But then that overlooks the fact that it's not an either or, it's this and that, and the combined effect of this. So yeah, we can estimate that lack of electricity has cost the economy 3-4% growth annually. On top of that, BEE has also cost another 3% annually. And also previous research we've done is that, and shows clearly that BEE policies, specifically preferential procurement and localization rules that all fall under this empowerment umbrella, that has inflated electricity prices by at least 27%, just in terms of primary energy costs. If you add management costs and all of that, then you might reach a figure of 40 to 50% that we're overpaying for electricity.
A BEE premium, if you will.
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not just the combined effects of poor infrastructure as well as these empowerment policies, it's the fact that these two overlap. So it's not either or, it's both and in this case, it's also the two are related to one another. So you can trace back a lot of the issues with infrastructure to a lot of these empowerment policies in and of themselves. So to treat those as two entirely separate issues is, that's an issue in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned preferential procurement, and Sakelige was involved with litigation against the Preferential Procurement Act, specifically around pre-qualification criteria. So bids for government work were not only given preference to black-owned firms, but in order to bid in the first place, you had to be 100% black-owned. Sakelige took this case to court, and the Free Market Foundation's Rule of Law Project joined this case as an amicus curiae, friend of the court. And we argued, and were ultimately successful in this argument, that there was a violation of the separation of powers. The finance minister didn't have the right to extend this to other organs of government, provinces and municipalities and so on. But what was very interesting about that litigation, and this is to your point earlier, was that there was a security company, I think it was Fidelity, that employs 60,000 people. They were also part of the litigation. Most of those 60,000 are black people, but they didn't meet the 100% black ownership criteria and were therefore completely frozen out of any tender processes. And so that's, I think, a very illustrative example of how the policy is supposed to benefit poor black people, but actually it really benefits a politically connected elite and doesn't really care about the fortunes of your average security guard or somebody who works in the retail sector or somebody like that. It's more about that elite class that's looking for benefits.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Zondo Commission also drew a clear link between black economic empowerment and state capture. And I mean, you don't have to be very smart to imagine the only outcome of black economic empowerment paired with the ANC's policy of cadre deployment. The inevitable end result of that would be state capture. So when people say, no, it's the 9 lost years or the 9 terrible years under Zuma, BE played a massive role in the 9 lost years. And to then say, no, but it's state capture, not BE. The two can't really go without each other. They're conjoined twins. And in order to solve the problem of state capture, which didn't come to an end when Zuma left the presidency, you'd have to get rid of the core root of it. And that root is black economic empowerment. You've mentioned that only elites are benefited, and some other researchers have estimated this to be roughly 100 people, which is also not a coincidence. The ANC for a long time, and probably still have the policy of creating 100 black industrialists. And there it is, 100 people being benefited over and over again by black economic empowerment. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I'd love to see the creation of thousands of black industrialists. I'd love to see industrialists of all races being created, but you're not going to do that without creating new industries. And BE's only contribution to the creation is to redistribute existing companies and existing structures to new people. That's not creating, that's redistributing. And you can't circularly empower people and expect true empowerment to ensue from that. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, those industrialists need to create themselves rather than rely on some politician.
Exactly, and I mean, if we look at industrialists from the past, probably the greatest example in South Africa would be Hendrik van der Bijl, who started Eskom for the government, but that benefited all of South Africa. So that could have been a route to say, look, we'll give you assistance, South Africa's in desperate need of this, and then privatize it afterwards. That would have been a much more beneficial model to follow, rather than saying, look, there's the white monopoly capital, we have to get our hands on that by hook or by crook and redistribute it. Nothing new has been created. But some people who were generally already quite rich became immensely wealthy through BEE at the cost of, what's it now, 20 million people looking for jobs who are unlikely to find any jobs. Youth unemployment rate of 60% plus. That's the end result of this policy.
I think it was significant that you mentioned that year 2007, because in the preceding years building up to this, we were actually experiencing some significant growth in South Africa, of north of 5% for several consecutive years. Unemployment was coming down, it was at about 22%. The debt to GDP ratio was at about 26% in the mid-2000s. But now the debt is about 78% in proportion to the size of the GDP, and unemployment is rising.
Yeah, and I think that what that really shows is that a lot of the other solutions that have been proposed, increasing government spending, increasing spend on infrastructure, expanding the role of the state, all of those have failed because we actually had a decrease in the government spending in those initial years in the 90s. That continued on through the early 2000s, and those are actually the periods in which we experienced the most growth. The periods in which government spending was constantly lowering as a proportion of GDP, and the involvement of the government was also being drawn back to a significant extent. It's only really after 2007, 2008, 2009, particularly after the global financial crisis, where you see not only a dramatic increase in government spending, but also a dramatic decrease in GDP. And it really does become a vicious cycle. So you have these policies which actually legislate inefficiency because they're so focused on redistribution, and the moment you introduce such very hard, very harsh redistribution schemes, you also introduce a whole load of friction into the system. So it's not only that you're redistributing wealth instead of creating wealth, it's also that you're destroying a hell of a lot of wealth by saddling the economy with all of these inefficiencies. A bunch of decisions made by both private actors and the state, which aren't governed by what's going to be the most efficient or the most productive or the most meritocratic, but rather what's going to be the best given the compliance rates that we have to achieve. And the moment you do that, and it doesn't really matter who you're trying to benefit, the moment you do that, you are going to negatively impact everyone. And in the case of South Africa, you're particularly going to negatively impact those who are already poor. And in the case of South Africa, that happens to be black people and the vast majority of the population. They do bear the brunt most severely in terms of the policies and in terms of a lack of economic growth. And that's also just to touch on the redress component again, whether or not, because that could be a point of debate. You could say, well, yes, it might cost something, but there are overweening benefits on the other side. And I think that people are generally skeptical about that in any case. But just to put some more figures on that, to make it more concrete, you can actually see in the inequality statistics published by government itself, by Statistics South Africa, a lot of people do emphasize the fact that we're just as unequal as we were at the dawn of democracy. And that's largely true. It's maybe ticked down slightly. But that doesn't mean that nothing's changed. It's the old composition fallacy. So just because the overall statistic looks roughly similar doesn't mean there hasn't been a lot of changes on the underlying data. And that's really what you see in South Africa, and it really bears out what Theuns mentioned about those, the roughly 1 trillion rand wealth transfer to roughly 100 people. You can actually see that in terms of the inequality data in South Africa. So whereas overall inequality is roughly the same as it was in 1994, 95, you can see that the overall figure has been completely changed. It's the same degree of inequality, but it's an entirely different kind of inequality. So whereas inequality was mainly a between-group phenomenon at that stage, it's now almost entirely, roughly over 2/3 of inequality in South Africa is inequality within particular groups, and in particular within the Black African group itself. So when people do see statistics that show that inequality is we're still the most unequal country in the world, what one has to add to that then is because there are huge wealth disparities within the Black population group, far greater than there is between any other population group and the Black African group, or any other population group compared to any other, or within that group itself. So the inequality that we have today is an inequality that was manufactured by the BEE policies, the policies that enriched the politically connected, and did that to the detriment of not a particular group, but to all other South Africans. There's only one set of beneficiaries, those are the politically connected, and there's one set of people that are facing the detrimental effects of the policies, and that's everyone else. It's not really a population group issue anymore. It's now only a politician versus population issue.
So Theuns, what about some international comparisons that you highlight in the report? There are other countries that have similar programs. How successful have those been?
Yeah, David, the major point that we clearly show in this report is South Africa's BEE policy, or empowerment or redress policy, is by far the most intrusive of all. Namibia is perhaps comparable, and in Namibia we can also see they didn't really have a major redress policy. They had some, but then in 2015, after a couple of years of robust growth in Namibia, they implemented the new NEEF program, the new economic guidelines that regulate the Namibian economy, and immediately the next year economic growth dropped. They had a couple of years of negative growth since 2015. So it's clear that implement these policies, and it comes at a massive cost to your economy. Then you also have Malaysia, fairly intrusive, where the Bumiputra population group or native Malaysians are given preference. We also see that it's created vast economic disparities within that group, and also to a large extent kept especially Indian business owners out of the Malaysian market. But besides those two, most policies like which we have in Brazil, in the USA, most of those have now come to an end, fortunately. Most of those is not set to keep certain groups out of opportunities, but to include certain groups. Like in India, for instance, to ensure that some people or certain groups have political representation. So it's not, we'll keep everyone else out of the economy to your benefit. It will make sure that you're represented. Or in the US, certain groups that may have been underrepresented in terms of education opportunities, to ensure that they then are given access to those education opportunities. Of course, then at the cost of limited spaces at universities. So by promoting the interests of one group, you are devaluing the opportunities of another group, but to a very limited extent. It's not like in South Africa where clear racial quotas are applied, especially in medical schools, and there's no way to get past that. Some solutions to that may be to disregard the racial requirement and say we'll look at the average income level of the school that this first-year student comes from, which would also have roughly the same effect without discriminating on racial grounds. But that's perhaps an issue for another day. And whether we want any restrictions besides merit is also a discussion that we must have as a country. I mean, you can't sit with this negligible economic growth. I mean, in real terms and in per capita terms, South Africa's been in a recession, in and out of, but mostly in a recession since 2012 now. I mean, that's just not sustainable. You can't have any form of empowerment at this background. So in terms of merit, that should be the only thing that counts. You can't really build an economy on anything else. Also, if you look at the most efficient use of people's time, at this stage, some of the most brilliant minds in South Africa are helping people fill out BEE scorecards. You have entire companies, large companies, listed companies, whose sole focus and purpose is to help other companies comply with BEE. And surely, I mean, to sustain those companies, it must come at a massive cost. And for something completely irrelevant to economic growth, for something that bears no real fruit to our economy, I mean, people would say, well, in order to make an omelette, you have to break a few eggs. I'm yet to see the BEE omelette.
Yeah, and in many ways, I think it speaks to the bureaucratization of South Africa's economy. So not only do you have this cottage industry of BEE compliance firms, but also law firms, auditors, all kind of nourished by this system. But what the impact of that is that you're actually crowding out other more productive value generating activities that could be creating real prosperity in South Africa, and quite easily and quickly actually. If we look at some other countries, say in Eastern Europe or East Asia, that over a period of say 30 years, which is the amount of time that's passed since 1994, have fundamentally transformed their economies and improved living standards and living conditions and created opportunity for people.
Yeah, David, we have transformed our economy. We had by far the largest and most efficient economy in Africa. We now have one of the largest and most efficient economies in Africa. So there's a clear transformation there. We've gone backwards. We definitely did not achieve any of the objectives of BEE. We've definitely missed all our developmental goals. And for what? I mean, the government almost creates the idea that they fear growth. They say if we're going to have growth, it must be inclusive growth, neglecting the fact that all growth is inclusive, nobody grows or becomes rich in isolation. We can see South African towns where there's been capital flight. If the big firms or big employers leave town, the entire town collapses with it. So now people can say and it has actually been said that these rich people leaving certain towns is a win for equality. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous, the lack of thought that's put into these policies. So if everyone becomes equally poor in the mind of the absolute equalitarian, that's a win. It's absolutely ridiculous. You can't build an economy on that. And that's the exact effect that BEE has had. It's enriched a lot of people and made a lot of people equally poor. So if we take out the rich elite, view them as a separate victory, then overall equality for everyone else could also then be construed as a victory. It makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah, and of course, as our colleague Martin van Staden has meticulously documented in his race law index, South Africa has 145 race laws on the statute books. And this has the effect of, I think, polarizing society and exacerbating racial tensions. And so, I mean, not only is there an economic cost, but there's also a fraying of the social fabric that occurs when you're now doing what the Employment Equity Amendment Act is doing, which is, forcing quotas on firms and other organizations within the state to be demographically representative. So, Morné, do you have any thoughts on those consequences as well?
Yeah, I think that, and that is one of the common retorts, is that the benefits aren't necessarily economic benefits. This is the second line of reasoning if you're hoping to defend the policies, that they're not necessarily hoping to achieve some sort of economic outcome, or rather that they're not primarily trying to achieve an economic outcome. They're trying to achieve some sort of social cohesion. And I think that's just completely undermined by the fact that there is no social cohesion with increasing poverty, with increasing unemployment, with a lack of economic growth. All of those things undermine social cohesion, and they undermine stability in an economy. And there's this increasing, almost sort of a quasi-gangster threat on the part of government that if not for these policies, then there's going to be a civil war. It's almost sort of a shakedown. It's between us or between you and the South African populace stands us. And if we get it out of the way, then there's just going to be an all-out war. And I think that that's on the one hand a very immoral threat on the part of the government, and on the other hand, it's also a very inaccurate one, because the fact is that these policies don't foster cohesion. They foster dissent, they foster unhappy relations, not only between people, but also for people in general, for people in and of themselves. And I think that it's just quite clear, even on that score, that the policies aren't getting anywhere near to what they should be accomplishing. And it's not just the fact that the inefficiencies aren't just on the level of particular cottage industries. It's even within companies themselves. When you talk about an inefficient allocation of resources, that also has to take account of the time of employees, the time of particularly your top management and so forth. So not only do these policies impact the appointments that are being made at that level, they also impact the way that top management or the executive level spends their time. Even if it's just 10% of your time being spent on that, as opposed to making your product better or increasing the efficiency of your employees, or even making your employees happier. If you're spending even just 10% of your time on that, that means that's 10% not being spent on your core business. That means you're 10% less efficient than you otherwise would have been. And that's really what you have to take into account when you're looking at these figures. Is we're not saying that it's necessarily the worst of all worlds. We're just saying that it's not the most efficient allocation. So we're saying 3% loss in GDP per annum. That means that's 3% we could have had. That doesn't mean you're necessarily doing something extremely poorly. Maybe you're getting a 9 out of 10 instead of a 10 out of 10. But the difference between 9 out of 10 and a 10 out of 10 is 10%. And 10% can be enormous when you're calculating that over the impact of an entire economy or entire industry and so forth. So it really is something that people need to keep in mind, again, when comparing it to the fact that on the benefit side, there's very little to show for it on the level of the overall economy.
Yeah, if you aggregate that, even 1% economic growth at the GDP level, there is a compounding effect over time. So it might seem fairly negligible what's the difference between 1 and 2% economic growth, but it's actually enormous if you scale it up over the course of decades. Theuns, you mentioned something about growth being a good in and of itself. You don't need a caveat like inclusive growth. And I think that that's very important. So it might, and you point this out in the report, it might be the case that there are actually some peripheral benefits to some of these scorecard metrics like supplier development or skills development. But many of these things are features of economic activity anyway. If you are a restaurateur and you want customers to come to your restaurant, you have an incentive to make sure that your staff are adequately trained so that they can serve your customers and make good food. And likewise with your suppliers, you want to make sure that your supply chain is in good order and that you're getting the goods that you want and that your suppliers are capacitated to do that. So I think we need to change the conversation around we don't need the state to come with its regulatory hammer and force people to behave in a certain way. Through the natural process of incentives, of profit seeking, people making their own assessments, we will have many of the benefits that BEE ostensibly proposes. What are your reflections on that?
Yeah, no, for sure, David. The skills development one is one of the components that's not completely money down the drain. But what it does do is it influences who's receiving training and also what training is being received, because not all forms of training that may be relevant to a company qualifies to get a reimbursement through the skills development program. So that's one thing. Everything else is whether it's to the company's indirect or direct benefit or not, because it's enforced, it's a cost that the company would not necessarily have had without this scorecard. Many of it, especially when it comes to supplier development, you're in a way forced to do your purchasing from certain suppliers who might realize that they've got a stranglehold on that part of the economy and can inflate their prices drastically. So the end result is lack of economic growth, which breeds poverty, and poverty creates a market for hate. I mean, if Julius Malema goes to a poor community and tells them, look, you're poor because David Ansara and the white cabal took everything that's supposed to be yours from you, they're not going to believe him if they're doing all right. But BEE is creating this incentive for keeping people poor, which breeds hate and which creates a comfortable landing place for this type of rhetoric to tell people, look, you're poor because of this and that. Whereas the remedy, the proposed remedy, BEE is actually to a large extent the cause of poverty, inequality, and all these other social ills, especially economic social ills.
So, Morné, why do you think policymakers continue to double down on BEE? I mean, you're both very well-credentialed people, economists and philosophers and so on, but I don't think you need an advanced university degree to know that BEE is harmful to the economy. Why the doubling down? If the costs are so evident, why do policymakers persist?
Yeah, I think Theuns touched on it a little bit earlier. I think there are incentives not only on the part of government, obviously those are the people quite often who benefit most directly from the policies, people who are either in government or connected to those in government. It's quite clear why they would want to perpetuate the system. But there's also some incentives on the part of business. The old adage is that big business loves big government. And you can see that with these policies as well, is large companies, very large entities, they have an incentive to keep these policies in place, not in spite of their compliance costs, but because of their compliance costs. Because they're so onerous, because they're so difficult to comply with, that means that unless you've already established yourself in the industry, it's very difficult to actually get to the point where you are competing with the larger companies in South Africa. And South Africa, that's another point at which South Africa is quite an outlier in terms of global economic outcomes, is we have an extremely concentrated stock exchange, and we have an extremely stagnant stock exchange in terms of comparing the top companies of today with the top companies of 10 years ago. In normal economies, you'll see those change constantly. You'll constantly see there'll always be a top 10 or a top 40 in the New York Stock Exchange, but the actual companies that are in those positions will constantly be changing. In South Africa, that's not the case, because we've erected all of these barriers to entry. We've erected all these things that make it almost impossible for the smaller companies or the medium-sized companies to compete with the larger companies. So there's an incentive on the part of government, there's an incentive on the part of business, and then I also think that there's just a general lack of political will in South Africa, where we have leaders in government, particularly in our largest party, which have almost tied the identity of the party to the identity of the country, and that in exchange to these empowerment policies. We couldn't give growth, we couldn't give an answer to unemployment, we couldn't give working infrastructure, but we do have this one policy that we can sort of hang our cap on, and if we let that go, then there really is nothing remaining. So I do think that it's actually a lot of concentrated benefits and then a lot of dispersed costs. The costs, because they're borne by the masses, aren't as tangible as the benefits, which are very concentrated and which show each individual person that benefited from the system. They've benefited greatly. And they can easily point you to themselves and to their friends and say, but look at what it's done for me. But that's a very tangible benefit, but it's it does sort of plaster over the enormous economic costs on the other end. And unfortunately, those people and the millions of people who bear the economic costs don't have as big a voice as those people that are really benefiting and on whom the benefits are concentrated mainly.
And many of those beneficiaries wrote angry letters to the newspaper denouncing our report. It wasn't the poor masses in the townships of Mamelodi or Khayelitsha who were doing so. The ones who are really bearing the brunt of those costs, which, as you point out, are kind of diffused throughout the whole economic system. So, Theuns, maybe we can end off with you. And I think part of the challenge here is to articulate a vision, an alternative reality that doesn't include BE, but which says that actually if you empower individuals, black or white, to be agents of their own economic advancement, that they can achieve great things, but they have to take responsibility for that themselves, that no government is going to deliver that for you. And maybe the government can do things like provide certain infrastructure and so on. We, as libertarians here, would like to see as much privatized as possible. But I think it's very important to be able to have that vision. And for all of the failures of BE, it does have a coherent internal philosophy, even if we disagree fundamentally with that philosophy. So how do we demonstrate the benefits of market-led growth to ordinary South Africans?
Yeah, David, unfortunately, BE is not the only one of these hindrances. I mean, we're in a massively over-regulated economy. So by just stopping that over-regulation, stopping BE enforcement, we can already go ahead by leaps and bounds. I mean, to just have policy surety, that would also go a long way. Obviously, things like privatization, looser licensing requirements, we see that everywhere, which oftentimes BEE is part of that licensing requirement. If all of that can get scrapped or at the very least reduced, then we can move ahead by leaps and bounds. Our report shows if we didn't forego that extra 3% growth, unemployment would currently be at roughly 17% rather than 32, 33, where it's at currently. So that's already an enormous improvement. And I mean, economic growth begets more economic growth. So it would have likely been much lower had these policies not existed. So unfortunately, these alternative realities for now are purely imaginary. But let's hope that government steps out of the way. If they insist on redress policies, then perhaps something in terms of employee shareholder schemes. I mean, surely if you want to empower people through ownership, employees should be first in line. Many other things could be done to replace BEE, but before we talk about replacing it, I think the first step should be abolishing it and create a freer market for everyone. Make it easier for people to enter the labor market, make it easier for people to start new businesses. Currently, unfortunately, BEE creates poverty and poverty begets more poverty. And the first step should be to stop this process from repeating itself.
Yeah, one of those angry letters suggested that criticism of BEE should be criminalized. And once I got over my initial astonishment at that kind of thinking, I comforted myself by saying that, well, actually, by saying that, you've admitted that you've lost the argument because you want to coerce your opponents.
Yeah, David, and it's very generous of you to refer to that as thinking.
Yeah, I'd want to emphasize on this point that it's not as though we're describing some sort of alternative reality that at this stage only exists in our own imaginations. That's another point that's important in terms of the historical overview, is that the vision we have is the vision of a Madiba or the vision of a Mbeki, or if not the vision, then at least the policies we saw. We've seen not only a more free market work throughout history and in the rest of the globe, we've seen it work in South Africa. There's nothing inherent to our economy that says it has to stagnate or unemployment has to go up. We've seen it go down. We've seen the economy grow. And why would it be so difficult just to say that we should go back to policies that were ANC policies not too long ago, policies that were the policies of Mandela or Mbeki or so forth, policies that have been in place and that have borne fruit, not just in other countries, but also in our country itself. So it's really not as though we're advocating something too radical. It's something that we've seen work throughout history and within our own country. And I think part of the vision is also just to have the vision to say that, it hasn't always been this way. And it doesn't have to be this way going forward either.
Yeah, and I think we can't expect the authors of these policies to have a Damascus Road conversion and suddenly realize that the ideological underpinnings of their policy program is fundamentally flawed and that they're going to abandon it. We have to push and challenge these policies, which is what our organization and others have been doing. And so our report is not just merely interesting research. We actually want to dismantle this system and push back against it. And I think it's very important for particularly private firms and leaders of organizations in the private sector to also take it upon themselves to resist bad laws. And I think as ugly as the amendments to the Employment Equity Amendment Act are, the fact that they, in all seriousness, are proposing that you reduce the number of white males in your organization to 4%, I think it's also an overreach on behalf of the state. And I think the folly of what they're proposing is an opportunity for right-thinking people, reasonable people to say, well, actually, we can't in good conscience implement this in our organization, and we're going to conscientiously object to this or find a way to minimally comply or to avoid these regulations. And that's what I want our audience to take away from this conversation.
Yeah, David, but we also have to remember who we're dealing with here. In my mind, and I trust in yours, social engineering is a swear word, but then you have the minister saying in interviews, look, if we don't do these types of social engineering and we don't enforce it, it simply does not happen. And for them, it's imperative that the state engages in this type of social engineering, whereas for everyone else, I mean, it's kind of hard to believe that anyone can think it's a good thing, that anyone can think, look, we don't care if you're an individual capable of making your own choices. As government, it's our responsibility to make better choices on your behalf. I mean, for any reasonable person, it's unimaginable that something like that can ever come to bear. But in their minds, that's the duty of the state.
Yeah, and I think that another point which relates to what you mentioned earlier, David, it's also about actually creating a permission structure for people to object. To seeing as, you know, we've all sort of acknowledged the fact that on the part of government, there's not going to be much change unless that change is really demanded on the part of the public. So it's actually empowering people to, you know, reject these policies and to feel safe in rejecting these policies. And I do see an increase in the willingness on the part of the public and on the part of private enterprise to actually criticize these policies. Because the fact is, and this is another point that really bears emphasizing, is that there's a broad consensus that the economy's been performing extremely poorly. It's not been performing poorly because of my policies or your policies or Theuns's. There's really only been one party in charge, and there's been one set of policies that have ruled the roost. And at some point, people are going to have to say, you know, should we really be taking our economic advice from the people who have run an economy into stagnation for almost 2 decades now? And that's really something that you have to mention to the people that are, you know, referring to government in order to support their arguments. The people who they're not only defending, but the people who they're taking their lead from are the very same people who have created an economy that has one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, one of the slowest growing economies in the world, and is one of the poorest in terms of poverty and one of the most unequal. So if ever there were people that you weren't going to follow, whose advice you aren't going to follow, then surely that must be the ANC's. And thankfully, you do see an increasing willingness on the part of the public in general and then private business in particular to do exactly that.
Yeah, and I think South Africa and South Africans are capable of great things. And if you believe in advancing black people, black businesses, you can still believe that and reject BE at the same time. BE, I think, is misnamed. Should be called BPE, Black Political Empowerment, because that's the people who have benefited the most. But gentlemen, I wanted to thank you very much for your important research, for sharing your insights with us today, and to answer some of the critics as well, which I think was very important. And I also want to say a special thanks to Solidarity for creating the spark for this important work and for the other initiatives that you undertake. I think civil society has a huge role to play in creating alternative forms of order to the state. And I think that we can achieve great things through the power of organized civic action. So thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, David.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation and you would like to support our work, the easiest way you can do that is by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. If you'd like to contribute financially to the Free Market Foundation, there's a link in the description where you can support us through that means. I'd also like to say a very special thank you to Sakelicha as well as New Ending Media for making this production possible. Thanks very much. Stay free.